right, welcome. We are with Test Double. We're a software development consulting agency, and we're talking about perspectives on Agile and Scrum today. My name is Kathy Qualiver, and I'm head of marketing at Test Double. Our panelists today are consultants at Test Double. That's Chris Kiriganis, Joel Helbling, Jamie Phelps, and Steve Jackson. As I mentioned just a moment ago, we've got a code of conduct available via link in the chat, and our host will be monitoring for any violations. So thank you in advance for choosing to be kind and empathetic today. Feel free to submit questions as we go through in the Q&A Zoom tool. And if there's anything we can't answer live, we'll post an answer on Twitter later on. Test Double has embedded with hundreds of engineering teams. And that means we've helped thousands of developers over 10 years, which feels pretty awesome. But that also means our developer consultants have seen just about every flavor of across the wide spectrum of what we call Agile now today. And that also means we've seen examples where Scrum can tend to value processes over people. So today we're going to talk about the types of things that Scrum is trying to address. And we're also going to cover what we've seen work with Scrum, what's tricky with Scrum, but mostly we want to address why Agile values people over processes and what that means for how to choose processes that work for your team. If you have any questions come to mind, enter them in the Q&A and we'll cover them. The inspiration for this conversation on Agile and Scrum came from another Test Double agent, Pam-Marie Guzzo, who posted a really neat message in our Slack. We've got a pretty active Slack community. And this read, "The longer I do Scrum, the more I think it's actually antithetical to being Agile. Sprints mean people aren't flexible or are rushing. Tons of time is spent on story grooming, refining, estimating that feels wasteful." So that's a pretty bold opinion. And that's not something we're shy about doing, is sharing bold opinions to be helpful. At the same time, we also like to say that we meet clients where they are, because we say we build not just great software, but great teams. So we're going to start our discussion today around each of the panelists. What do you think and feel about Scrum emerging from Agile? And also, what are some experiences you've had around meeting clients where they are, or more specifically, where their team's flavor of Agile is? We'll start with Steve.
Yeah, I mean, meeting people where they are is such an important part of our collaborative process of helping folks out. So like it's important that we understand the context that they're working in. And a lot of times that means that teams are doing some flavor of Agile, and it's often Scrum based. It seems like it's almost bad to not be an Agile software team now. Like it's something you'd be embarrassed about. So there is a certain like desire for teams to check that box, be like, yes, we're Agile, and Scrum handily is very well defined. It's got a nice blueprint. You're like, I want to be Agile. I will do this thing that is obviously like, I can do this. I can follow this. And what like seems to happen with a lot of teams is like Scrum puts a lot of emphasis on individual technical decisions and details like story grooming, things like that Pam-Marie alluded to. And if you're at certain points in your like software career and your team's like maturity, like it's really appealing to like, I know exactly what to do. Everything is specified. I do this, I do that. But as you sort of mature, that becomes sort of chafing and you want a little more freedom to work. And in that case, like Scrum maybe starts to feel like a bad shoe.
Yeah, I kind of think that's right. I think that Scrum is one expression of the Agile ethos, and nowadays it seems like people take Scrum as the best or the ultimate expression of Agile, rather than being one outcome of taking these Agile principles and applying them and discussing them with the team to decide how they want to work. So that's something that I found really valuable, is working with teams to talk through the underlying principles that it can lead to some or most of the parts of Scrum being implemented, but without having to buy into a whole program that people often think if they just tick off of these boxes, like Steve said, that they're going to be immediately a successful and functional team. And working with them to understand that they've got to go through this process of figuring out what Agile looks like for their team is an important mindset shift, I think.
Yeah, I do think that Scrum has become ubiquitous enough that for a lot of people, probably it's almost synonymous with Agile. And that's a signal for the success of that approach. It's been interesting to get a chance to work in an alternate methodology, shape up, and to see how ultimately we are working with basically the same challenges and pressures, but a different methodology had the effect of kind of shifting where those pressures emerged. And so it's kind of interesting to see how I think a lot of times the focus in Scrum practice can be on the contract between the business and the people delivering software. And of course, ShapeUp also has such a contract, but I think there tends to be a lot more visibility into the challenges around actually preparing the work to be done. Whereas I think a lot of times with Scrum, there's more of there can be at least a more collaborative approach that's involving the development team in that. So I think we do tend to take the approach of meeting our clients where they are, and generally that has meant Scrum for a lot of years now. But of course, you see it done where it seems to be pretty smooth and working pretty well, and you also see cases where there's some dysfunction and some anti-patterns emerging.
Yeah, I really like that that frame of where the pressures arise, and I think that's something that we'll probably be visiting a lot during the discussion. For my part, most of my Scrum experience has come at organizations and companies where it's a large company, software is a cost center, and from what I've seen in these orgs, they have a stronger tendency to lean on guides, certification, authoritative sources of process. And I think that grows out of, thinking about pressures, I think that grows out of an attempt at reconciling what teams need to be productive and what companies need in terms of predictability and measurement, and things like that. So because of that, I resonate with a lot of what Pam's saying. I think that sort of is hinting at a root cause. So, yeah.
Thank you. So taking that a level further, when Scrum is used either in whole or in part, what are some ways that it works as a mechanism and doesn't work to actually organize the jobs that are being done, the work that's being done?
I think that one of the things I've encountered is that people that are not involved in the direct delivery of software are, project managers, product owners, Scrum leaders. They often have a difficult sense of understanding what their value is to the team and like what the specific verbs of their involvement in successfully delivering the project are. And it can be really rewarding to uncover those and highlight them for those folks to have kind of more concrete understanding of their impact on the successful outcomes of the team.
That's phenomenal. I have experience as a project manager as well, and that's something I completely value. And something I notice is that project managers often have a wider view on projects, and because they're working across functions, and there's ways they can add value by helping reduce rework if they've got a deeper understanding of what's going on. So how do we get clearer requirements or understand where there might be dependencies that could create delays or could create rework?
I've had this conversation a lot also with folks that are involved with like user experience. Like there's this need to get in front of the developers that I've heard like feed the beast. Like how do we get them the wireframes? How do we get them the user research they need so that they can just pick things up and go? And you know, no one wants to get behind these developers that just seem to like keep moving, and like we have to keep feeding them things and you never get to take a break. And I think at some level that's kind of what Scrum promises, is like we can be predictable. We can say that yes, in 3 weeks we'll get to this thing because we committed to doing this stuff in the last sprint or whatever. And I think that is sort of what it's trying to get to, is to highlight that we need to do some things before coding starts. And if we can figure out how to do that correctly, we might end a steady state where folks aren't like constantly racing to get ahead.
Yeah, I hate to keep bringing up Shape Up in a conversation about Scrum, but I think that in Shape Up you also see that same pressure to feed the beast. One thing I will say about Scrum that I think can work well is the degree to which that approach is engineered to provide visibility into the work for stakeholders, for managers. It's pretty well developed, and so it has that going for it. I would also say, though, that there is a potential for that to kind of become a problem if the metrics used for understanding the way the work is progressing are then turned towards being used as ways to try to provoke more work out of the team, i.e., when we start chasing velocity instead of using velocity to understand how the work is going, which is, of course, going to be a factor of the capabilities of the team and the nature of the work. So Scrum has some really great tools for visibility, but it is important to approach those tools with the right perspective on what they can actually tell us and what they really can't do for us.
Yeah, what they can't do. I think that one of the main ideas of Agile, as I understand it, is that there is an irreducible unpredictability about software development and even about what businesses need, right? Like, you know, the future is unpredictable, and yet we need to plan. So, you know, the process question becomes, where do you want to push that uncertainty? Do you want to push that uncertainty upwards towards the requirements and risk, you know, having to rework because something changes that was not accounted for? Or do you want to push that uncertainty closer to the point of execution and maybe not have as much forecasting ability as you would otherwise? But you know, that just goes right back to, you know, the trying to balance the interests of like what's good for a thoughtful creative process and what's good for being able to, you know, understand and have visibility into it. So.
Yeah, I agree with that, with the notion of balancing the uncertainty versus the ability to forecast, and combining that with what Steve said, that, you know, there's this impetus to always be populating the backlog with as much work to be executed as possible. But some of the most frustrating times that I've worked with teams on is finding out that this feature that's being picked up for a given sprint was refined 6 months ago, and now the whole world has changed, and we have to basically go back and rework the feature, re-estimate, forecast how long this thing is going to take us to build. And so dialing in the right balance between refining close enough to execution of the work that we understand it as best we can versus the sacrifices of sort of longer range forecasting and predictability, and finding out what the balance is of that for the team's health and for the business, right? If the business requires longer term forecasting, then we have to negotiate with them and with the software team on this is going to impact some of our nearer term predictability, and it's going to create some churn in the way that we plan our short-term work because we have so much emphasis on the long term.
Thank you. So for everyone that's here with us today at Test Double, we often share things we learn along the way, and that's part of how this conversation came to be, was folks sharing what they've been observing and feeling about Agile and Scrum, and it's something we wanted to share with others. So we'd love to know what other content topics would be helpful to you, whether it's around Agile or other things that make sense as you're working to improve how you build software and your teams. So I've dropped a link in the chat for a 5-minute survey. If you complete that survey, we'll send you a Great Software is Made by Great Teams t-shirt and a Fun Road Programmer. And that just helps us provide more useful content around things we're learning along the way. Thank you, Steve. So going back to this conversation around Agile and Scrum, another piece of the thread around discussion that we thought would be really helpful to share with folks is the importance of retros and how retros can be this very healthy experience for the team because it can do so much. So I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts on that, because this is where Scrum does feel very agile.
Yeah, as a process that values team autonomy, I think that having some sort of regular collaborative feedback and reflection process is just table stakes. It's impossible to conceive of an autonomous team process without it. And I think that a phrase I like to use in this context is theory of change. Like if your team is going to evolve over time, how does that happen? And really the entry into that is reflection. And so where you go from a retro is another question, but I think any investment in improving your retro process and reflecting on the process itself is going to pay for itself. It's going to be time well spent.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the core of the entire Agile process is getting feedback as soon as possible, acting on that feedback, changing based on that feedback. And so to me, retrospectives are like, if you're going to throw out everything else, please keep that. Like, that's the one thing I really would like you to hold on to. But it is important that we do actually act on the things that we learn in the retrospective, because some teams fall into a pattern where we just kind of complain, and then the next time we get together, we complain again that things are still the way they were, and then people just get disheartened and it feels wasteful. So teams need to feel empowered to make these reflections, come up with these observations, and then actually affect change in the way that they work and the way they experience the work.
Yeah, Steve, I want to echo that, and to sort of pick up on the theme of teams feeling empowered. A lot of times there's sort of a progression or an evolution of the practice of the retrospective. I've seen teams where they weren't doing a retrospective and then they started doing them, sometimes with a lot of trepidation, fear from managers. Why would we want to do retrospectives? People are just going to complain. And there is honestly great benefit in just being able to vent. Like, that may be a beneficial and valuable thing. However, a series of those where people just vent and nothing changes ultimately will be a self-defeating process. And so, to echo what you said and what Chris was saying, it's about the series coupled with a commitment to try new things, make changes, and measure the impact of those changes that actually brings about the benefit and the value of the retrospective. It's ultimately, I think, a kind of trust building exercise where first and foremost we're building trust in ourselves to identify problems and take action where we're able within our sphere of influence. And then ultimately that works outward as we start to identify problems that we can't solve on our own, and we start to interact with people outside of the team to try to address those problems and begin to experience successes in tandem with folks outside of the team. So that can be a very positive outcome, but it doesn't always start off that way. Sometimes a retrospective at the outset may really be kind of like, just lancing a boil, getting everything out in the open, that cathartic experience. But we really want to see it go beyond that to actually start to be an effective ongoing process.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I really want to pick up on what Joel said about trust. The retro is a safe space. It's a place of trust, and part of the challenge with especially new teams is establishing that trust so that your retros become that place where it's a drive toward improvement and all of that. And I think that's one of the places that a really good facilitator can help to foster that environment of trust, especially when retros are new to the team. Maybe people are a little suspicious, maybe they're a little guarded. And I think that ultimately retros are kind of a pause point, a moment of reflection, and it helps to create this rhythm with the team between effort and execution and reflection and adjustment. And without a dedicated space for that, the business, the demands of the work, the backlog, all of that will just continue to drive us forward without the opportunity to make sure that, in Stephen Covey terms, our ladder is against the right wall.
That's awesome. Thank you. So speaking of trust and teams, do you all think that Scrum in and of itself reflects this tension between a development team and the rest of the org? And is that sort of why the structure exists?
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a distinct tension between what's necessary in order to do investigative and creative work. And I know this isn't I know this isn't how business school talks about things anymore, but I do feel like, especially in the English speaking world, like the ideas of mechanization and Taylorism are really baked into the ideology of how businesses are run. It's very much, even if it's not explicit, there still is the remnants of a stamping out widgets mentality. And so, being able to reflect what's happening in, like a software development practice through that lens is very difficult. It does create a tension. And I think that resolving that tension is what Scrum is about. It's about a mediation layer between those two ways of seeing the world. And, I don't want that to sound too grim. Like, I think that, like, understanding it that way, allows us to take a critical view and, arrive at more advantageous processes. But yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a big part of why we have Scrum.
Yeah, I think that hits on my experience as well. Like the chief driver for a lot of this is to make teams efficient as possible, right? Like we want them to keep moving. And my chief criticism with Scrum is that it introduces barriers and gatekeepers where they aren't necessarily beneficial. Like there are times when it is good to not have 20 stakeholders screaming at you, where's this feature, right? Like that makes sense in most cases. But there is also like this notion, like once we start introducing these like middle roles of Scrum Master and product owner and things like that, we put up these barriers between developers and folks that can get them the information, and vice versa, that information flow that could help solve problems more quickly, solve problems more innovatively, decide that we don't actually need to write software for this, like things like that. Those discussions can't happen as easily if there are these like intermediate layers that have purpose, but sometimes get in the way.
I personally kind of disagree about the negative impacts of the structure. I think that Scrum or whatever structure you have in place can provide a lot of clarity about how to communicate. I think one of the challenges that sometimes comes up is that communication or direction tends to flow one way, where if we have effective communication from the team back up to the business, then we can have effective feedback loops about why are we building this software shouldn't exist, all of those sorts of things. And I kind of think of the software team as kind of almost like an API for the rest of the organization. There's a clear entry point for talking to the team. There's a clear almost a contract for how we communicate work and how we communicate progress and all of that. And that structure I find to be really valuable, rather than having this explosion of potential communication paths.
Yeah, I think you're right. It is a contract, and I think that in the original literature, they use terms like commitments, this concept that we're going to take a certain set of features and we're going to work on them. We're going to commit to do these in this particular time frame, and so as the other three panelists here have pointed out, this is just kind of a way of managing and mitigating the uncertainty that's inherent in a kind of work that, in software development, but also in the context of business where uncertainty is pretty much a death knell. So I think that Scrum has potential to introduce the kind of structure that can be helpful. And it also has the potential to turn into something that sort of confounds and interrupts communication. So I think, like in the examples that in the pattern that Steve was describing, the pattern that Jamie was describing, we can see cases where there are interrupted communication channels, and we can see cases where communication channels work more efficiently. It really comes down to the intelligent use of the approach, to look beyond the methodology itself at the business and human communication problems that we're working with, and where it makes sense to leverage these methodologies to solve those problems, do so, and where it makes sense to bend the rules a bit and try something a little bit different. Sometimes that's the right answer as well.
Yeah, something we tend to say a lot here at Test Level is it depends, right? It depends on your situation and your team. For everyone who has joined us today, you can add your own question in the Q&A tool. We're gonna cover those next. We've got one from Nick that we'll cover more specifically. But this discussion is a great reminder of the Agile principle around people over processes, and that's something we really value at Test Level. Why is that so important with Agile, and how does a team then go about choosing the right fit processes that make sense for them?
Well, I would encourage them to de-emphasize the question of choosing a process and rather think of it more as discovering a process or arriving at a process. If you implement a full-blown batteries included process from an outside source, like the Scrum Guide, you have to think of that as a jumping off point. And that's very useful. And I encourage you to do so. Like starting from something rather than nothing is very important. But you want to move from there with your process. You want to arrive at the process that works for your team. And that brings me back to that phrase that I used earlier, theory of change, which is, you know, an enormous topic that has a lot to do with, you know, understanding people, understanding relationships, understanding needs and wants, and why people do the things they do. But what I would encourage is, if you want to be able to allow a team to arrive at a process that fits them well, you know, whether you're a contributor or leader or consultant, investing that time in developing a theory of change is time well spent.
I really like that, Chris. I like the notion of theory of change. And I think what a lot of teams, a lot of practitioners are maybe missing or feeling kind of adrift with is not having a toolbox to draw from to know what levers or knobs there are within their team to pull. So for me, learning about things like, you know, the basic stages of team formation from reading Laura Hogan's book, Resilient Management, to learning about systems, you know, from Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows, and using those as a way to understand where my teams are at any given point, what processes, what feedback loops are in place to be adjusted, or what part of a system might be missing to introduce. And that has given me a toolbox to draw from to pursue change with some amount of theory. And that's been really helpful. So looking for those building blocks that can allow every team to be unique, but also to arrive at a healthy process that they can feel confident in is, I think that's a really valuable skill to learn.
Yeah, my core belief here is that Agile is about feedback. It's about seeking feedback. It's about changing based on the feedback. And this is something that people are pretty good at. Humans can handle pretty well, but systems are not necessarily great at, and also are not good at all. You know, a self-driving car, an amazing system. Dude, it's amazing that we can do this at all. It can't scuba dive, right? There are boundaries, there are parameters that it just cannot handle in any real situation. And people over process is really kind of a reminder for me to, like, don't let the inertia of our existing system, our existing process flourish. Let's constantly look at the people that are on the team, figure out what works for them. And one thing that I always suggest to teams is to find some room for slack, to do some experimentation on these things, to be creative. Evolution is messy, change is messy. Like, you have to be okay with that. Like, we're gonna break some eggs. And it may not turn out great. Like, we don't always succeed either. So like it's important to go into this with like open eyes, but I think there are ways to make this safe. There are ways to like bound this in such a way that it's not catastrophic and things like that. And ultimately the goal is that we arrive at a place where our people can be the best they can possibly be, where we have the sort of innovation and, you know, a joy of actually like showing up to work and doing the thing that we like to do.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with the interpretation of people over processes as people are the most effective there. I also think there's another angle, which is the angle of what people need in order to engage in this kind of work. Creative work is vulnerable. It takes vulnerability to be able to take something that didn't exist, wasn't there, and turn it into a thing that works in the world. It requires incredible focus on the domain to the exclusion of focus on you know, certain aspects of self-preservation, et cetera. And I think that a lot of the methodologies that have emerged for writing software in again, this very uncertain, unpredictable environment of doing creative work in that environment, those patterns kind of emerge as a way to put the appropriate protection that people need in order to be able to focus and to solve problems in that kind of a space. So ultimately, whether you're using Scrum or some other approach, it's important to remember why people need these kinds of structures, why they might need some protection, and it's because we're engaging in something that's quite vulnerable. So
that is a lovely thought. How do we help people do their best work while we're also moving like the business goals forward? So now we're going to take questions from the audience. So first, we had one that popped up earlier from Nick Hodges, and it was, I don't know anyone that doesn't do Scrum. Is there anyone out there that claims to be doing Agile that doesn't do Scrum? So just like quick round robin here. Are you seeing, have you been seeing things that are completely without Scrum, so to speak?
I think maybe historically the biggest alternative to Scrum that I've seen is Kanban, and where Scrum kind of emphasizes sprints as a distinct and defined time box in which we're going to try to accomplish a predicted amount of work. Kanban tends to focus more on the complete cycle time of an individual piece of work. How much time did this story spend in process? It has different screens for the stakeholders than Scrum, and I think that a lot of managers have become comfortable and familiar enough with Scrum, with burn down charts, etc., that a shift to something like Kanban can be kind of disorienting. But it's not that Kanban doesn't have measurability, it's just measuring different kinds of things. Other than that, the only other methodology I've had a chance to work with lately, I'm not sure if it's considered part of Agile or not, but ShapeUp was really interesting as well. And I think that there are some very Agile-ish aspects to it. If we step back and squint and take a look at the Agile values, I think that ShapeUp has some aspects that are Agile-ish as well.
I think to go back to what I said early on, like I said, like teams are embarrassed if they're not doing Agile, but I do think there's like a counter surgeon as well, that folks are following a process that is not Scrum, so they are not Agile, right? Like just don't get that out of my mouth. I don't want to be part of that, so I'm not Agile, even though I maybe work iteratively and maybe I accept feedback from my users and maybe I retrospect every once in a while, but I'm not Agile, right? I don't do that cards on the board nonsense. And I think that's a potential thing here as well, is like there is sort of a counter backlash. To answer specifically, I have worked on Kanban teams. I find that's a good fit for lots of kinds of work where there's a high amount of interrupt. You can't really plan stuff 6 weeks in advance because like the thing that happens tomorrow is the most important thing that's going to happen in 6 months. And then the other thing I've seen is like teams that understand the principles behind Scrum and like what sort of signals and signals and things that are coming out of it, and sort of build their own process where maybe they don't write story cards specifically, maybe they go have a kickoff session with their product owner instead. Like that sort of thing I've seen be successful in places as well. But yeah, like stamping a methodology, like there aren't a whole lot of folks that are willing to go, put out that I'm Agile and this is exactly how you do it. Scrum is very brave.
Yeah, I've heard the term Scrum butt used quite often, which is, we're doing Scrum but not that piece. I think what's kind of interesting about Agile and Scrum is there's this dogma that can arise, that's kind of like received wisdom about what is required for something to be called Scrum or required for something to be called Agile. And Steve, I think your emphasis on feedback and that being the core of Agile I remember reading Agile web development with Rails, 15 years ago, and just having my mind blown that you could sit with someone who's a stakeholder and get that rapid feedback and deliver features, and that's what Agile is about at its core. Another thing we're fond of saying at Test Double is that people closest to the problem are the best equipped to solve it. So one of the things I think about Agile is that pushing a lot of the decision making out to the edge nodes of execution is kind of a core tenet of Agile as well. And Joel, to that point, I think that Shape Up definitely falls into that ethos as an Agile practice, because with a well-shaped pitch, a team can execute and make decisions and wield the scope hammer and all those concepts from Shape Up as they're going through the process without having to step out to a higher level to ask questions or permission.
Yeah, thank you for that. Another question that popped up that Jamie, you were on top of and already answered from Glenn, is books that were mentioned if we have a reading list. So in the answer questions, if you click in the Q&A, you should be able to see that. We've got the links. I'll copy it in the chat just in case, though, because I see host view, not everyone else's view. So those will be there. And that sounds like a great blog post to share our larger reading list, because we do have books we love. And we even do book clubs at Test Double on those. So next question from Miroslava: how can a communication between two sub-teams of developers, so they're separate teams, one big team, so they're sort of part of the same structure, but they're separated into two smaller ones with their own Scrum meetings, working on the same code base, how can that communication be improved?
I have a couple, I have seen this pattern a few times. I don't think it's uncommon at all. I think a couple things that I have seen work pretty well is finding some opportunity for some shared rituals for the team, whether sharing show and tell if your team does demos or things like that tends to be a good way to keep everyone in the loop and at least have a larger context. I've seen teams that are where the code base is maybe kind of technical and difficult, where they'll have a separate dev huddle kind of concept that happens outside of the normal stand-up ritual. And another one that I've seen that works really well, especially as you get past two sub-teams and into dozens of teams, is a concept of guilds, where all the folks that are really interested in React get together and kind of talk about patterns through the application. All the folks that are really into database performance get together and talk about database profiling and things like that. So that's a few things I can think of. But again, I think it's about finding some opportunities for communication collaboration. Jamie.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I've seen that. I've seen that be effective in some fairly large organizations, and that what that helps to do also is sort of refactor the problems. So when there aren't those guild kind of meetings, each team is kind of trying to solve those problems on their own. Whereas if we have these guild practices, we can bring those out to say hey, you know what, as a whole organization, we seem to have these database challenges, or we don't seem to have a design language for our front end. And then that kind of spawns off a new initiative. The other thing I've seen be effective for smaller teams working on the same code base, maybe it's 2 or 3 teams working on different features for a single product. That's where the strength of the product owner kind of comes into its own. Having someone who is able to participate as a product owner for multiple teams, communicate strategy, communicate what's going on from other teams, and highlight where there might be collisions, right? If we have a lot of collisions because we're working in the same code, not just the same code base, that's a different kind of question that probably points to some software structuring challenges. But if it's just a matter of sequencing feature work across multiple teams, a strong product presence across those teams can be really effective.
I also want to put in a good word for the individuals who just hop over the fence and go and ask questions or talk to people, or warm up communication channels through Slack, DMs, etc., what have you. A tremendous amount gets done by people coloring a little outside of the lines, and I think especially in larger organizations, it's easy to underestimate how much benefit we're getting out of conversations between people who aren't on the same teams. And the way that those come about is also interesting, because I think there are things that organizations can do in order to sort of foster opportunities for those kinds of connections to form. And I think that a lot of the times, some of the more apparently useless social activities, the water cooler talk, or the sort of fun things, happy hours, whatever, offer those opportunities for people to connect, begin to talk to each other. And what we've found in many years of working remotely, anything that warms up a communication channel lowers the resistance, the barrier to reaching out to somebody who you don't normally and routinely talk to. So that's another thing to think about as well.
I think also, just on a very practical nuts and bolts level, making sure that you're not neglecting the advantages of written communication as well. Because in a smaller group, if if the team starts to specialize, a lot of your synchronous face-to-face communication is going to be clustered, and having those conversations, some component of those conversations written and discoverable, allows that to be broadcast a lot more easily. A big thing that I would suggest here is utilizing pull request reviews effectively, like doing some code review across teams, across team boundaries is a good way to or even if it doesn't rise to the level of a full-blown review, just publicizing code as it's going in across those boundaries, just so that the awareness is there, I think is a good baseline thing to try.
That's awesome. I'm going to drop in the link. We've got a blog post around architecture decision records that's very helpful. So something to consider using if you don't already. Miroslava, if that didn't answer your question, please feel free to add an additional question. And other folks have questions, please drop those in the Q&A. We're also happy to chat further if you want to reach out to us. We're at Test Double on Twitter and LinkedIn and GitHub, and you can also just email us at hello@testdouble.com. So any other questions, we're happy to answer. Again, we'd love to share things we learn along the way. So I've got that link in the chat for that content topic survey, just a quick 5-minute survey. We'll send you a fun t-shirt and rubber duck programmer, and that helps us know what topics are helpful to you as we share things that we learn along the way. So any other questions, please drop them in the chat. Or sorry, the Q&A tool.
I've got a question if nobody else does.
Yes, go ahead.
I would be curious to hear what characterized the best experiences you've had with Scrum.
I think this touches on what Jamie said earlier. A really great product owner. Like I have note to all the product owners I've worked with. I sort of have a ranked list of best product owners I've ever worked with, and I could rattle it off if I had to. Just because of that, that is such a crucial part of the experience. I think I think that has been huge. And then also the other thing I'd say that's like subtle, but like has really hit me over the head over the last 5 years is teams that have less work in progress tend to be like amazingly great to work with and more effective, honestly. If you have a team where like every person has 2 cards assigned to them at the beginning of the sprint, it's really hard for like little collaboration moments to happen because I got to get my thing done, and then maybe I can help you with your thing, but I can't possibly help everyone with their thing and still get my thing done. And so I think there's a lot of those are sort of the 2 things I would say that shape a really great Scrum experience for me.
Yeah, I'd echo that about the product owner. The most rewarding work I did with the team was well, actually probably second, was with a product owner who was admittedly new to being a product owner in sort of an agile context. And she was so open to improvement and so motivated to grow that our suggestions at how to split up stories, how to think for the kinds of seams that we software developers would see in a story, we saw it within the course of 6 months. We were seeing stories that when we first saw them were probably 2 steps beyond what we would have seen when we first started working together. I don't know if this is making sense, but she was bringing us better stories within a few months of working together. And that feedback loop of her writing the best stories she could and then seeing where there were still opportunities for splitting them up or potentially even being too split up, like, no, these are actually just one thing, was really valuable to her growth, and it made the teams function just at a higher level.
For me, I can think of one instance where there was a very distinct phase shift in the reflective process, whereby the team went from a place of being able to identify, diagnose, and take action on problems in the process to beginning to identify opportunities and build the capacity to build, to make those opportunities real. That was a real noticeable phase shift in retros from that point on, and that was a really terrific experience.
That's amazing. Feedback is super valuable, and also being in a better place to identify those opportunities to improve the work. That's amazing. Thank you all. There are no additional questions. So, one just popped up. So let me cover that one. How has the accountability been enacted and managed by teams that you've worked on using Scrum? It's the 2-parter. Does the manager also hold the individual employees accountable for their work in this instance as well? Or did teams solely rely on systems of accountability set up with the Scrum team? That's a great question. Jamie.
I hear in that a possible danger moment where my question is, what's the purpose of this accountability? A lot of the more toxic teams I've been on, that accountability, or in Scrum's deprecated terms, commitment, has been used kind of as a cudgel to say, hey, you said you were going to do this and you didn't, and now you're in trouble, and all the bad things that fall from that. Accountability for growth, accountability for performance in the basics of executing and accountability for best intentions and assuming positive intent, right? Those are kind of core at Testable. And when I hear that there's a notion of accountability from the outside, if there's a question about, hey, what were the inputs that caused this to deviate from what we had planned, right? Like that's kind of a post-mortem kind of approach, or how can we improve this in the future, kind of a retro kind of approach. But if it's a one-on-one accountability as a stick, I'm generally suspicious of that.
I think Scrum is interesting in that it kind of there's a sense of I think it's bison or buffalo or something that would like sort of line up with all the horns out. And I think there is an ethos within Scrum that kind of says, we're offering you accountability as a team, and we're taking responsibility for things as a team. And so as such, I think there's a little bit of an immune system reaction to the idea of singling out an individual's performance. That being said, obviously, as employees in a business, we are also individually accountable. There's a certain class of issues like, if I show up drunk and I yell at people routinely, that's not necessarily anything to do with how I write software, but it's an issue, and it has to be dealt with probably, by the leadership within the company, the managers. On the other hand, trying to look into the kind of metrics that are being provided by Scrum and ascertain, is this developer having more output than that developer, particularly if they're leaning into some of the XP practices such as pair programming. Really, the tools are not there to effectively decide who is better. And it's also a good question as to whether that would really be valuable. We don't have any reason to expect that every developer is going to deliver an equal amount in every situation. We all have different strengths, different areas of competency. And so in one domain, you may see somebody really excel. In another domain, it may be somebody else who's taking leadership. And there's a certain amount of fuzziness that I think suits the environment. This goes back again to providing the protection for people to be able to work in a vulnerable way. Sometimes that vulnerability means that I'm sitting down to pair with somebody who knows way more about what we're working on than I do. And sometimes it might be reversed. So as far as really trying to fine tune performance of individuals, I don't think Scrum really lends itself to that, and for good reason. But there is, of course, a total there's a class of behaviors that obviously just sort of go beyond software that have to be dealt with. So there is individual accountability at some level. At areas that maybe fall on the border, you might have a situation where there's some behavior within a Scrum team that needs to bubble up or be escalated to a manager, and whatever the appropriate processes within the company would be.
Well, I would just echo every word of that. That was so important. And I think that it's one reason it's so important is because the types of decision making, the type of decision making you're participating in as part of a Scrum-based team, it's very important to have that insulation layer between, how you are influencing the decision of what work to do and when you're going to do it. Having that insulation between your personal accountabilities and your professional opinions on these things and your participation in that process is super important, because you don't want the pressures of individual assessment and accountability to color those decisions. Because you won't arrive at the optimal decision for the team in that case. There's other stuff interfering. So yeah, I think that's very important.
I think it's very easy for us to like glibly say it's the team's responsibility and the accountability goes there. But that's often not a true reflection of how the organizations work, right? Like the two things I think about, like on a Scrum team, all the decisions should be shared. Are they in fact actually all shared, or do people get railroaded into doing things, or vice versa, right? So I think there's a certain sense of like it falls down, right? Because like, you know, I'm fine with being held accountable for things that I decide to do and I help make the decisions on. It's more difficult to be like thrown into the fire when you didn't have any say in the matter in the first place. I think the other thing that's like interesting here too is around like, you know, it comes back to what Jamie said, like, what is the point of the accountability? Like, are we looking to blame folks? Are we building places where it's safe to be wrong? Or, you know, I think that's a big part of it too, is like having enough psychological safety that when we are looking to be accountable, the team is comfortable stepping up and helping each other find a better way to do things. And then is empowered to do so. I guess that's the important part too, right? Like I need to hold Joel accountable for not showing up ever to work, sort of thing, right? If I can't do that, then that kind of ruins the whole dynamic.
Yeah, I think that goes back to the notion of trust and safety, right? So in trust is, we all trust that within this team, we're doing our best to work toward a common goal. And then safety in being able to be wrong, or being able to show up really with the full, like, we're not machines. And so if I have a bad week because of something in my personal life, and that means a feature slips, I should have the confidence in my team, if things are going well, to say, hey, here's why that didn't happen the way that I thought it was going to. And I find that when accountability is used as a looming threat, that's a surefire way to get people to start hiding and start covering and start dissembling and evading, and then that breaks down the trust of the team, and the team no longer functions as a unit, and then Scrum kind of falls apart.
Right. People over processes. Thank you all so much, and thank you to the attendees for your very thoughtful questions. We appreciate you. We were so happy to be able to share these observations and thoughts on what we've learned along the way, and hope that helps you as you go on to work in your teams building great software. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Bye.